Henry Kissinger's new book, World Order, looks at the world geographically, divides it geographically, but it analyzes it culturally. And that's an interesting point, actually, given Kissinger's background as a German by background, spent to a large extent his teens and almost formative years in Germany, a country which has a huge emphasis in its culture on music, on literature, on philosophy. That's a clear element that he, in many of his writings, keeps going back to. Obviously, his background as a Harvard professor, and especially at Harvard, arguably the most established liberal arts university in the world, the idea and the notion of how cultures shape societies and shape their politics is ingrained in his thinking. And that's why, though he divides the world geographically, he very much approaches the different regions that he looks at in the book from a cultural point of view. The way he approached the notion of world order was through presenting his ideas as reflections, which also is quite interesting and also quite cunning way to some extent, because if you say it's a reflection, it means that it's not an analysis, and therefore it needs not to have a very specific argument. It means also that each chapter, by being a reflection, does not need to carry a message, or more importantly, for somebody with Kissinger's background, it need not to have a policy recommendation. And that gives him leeway to present his ideas as just ideas, mere reflections, as he put it. He starts the book with a point of departure, which is the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. And that treaty, which ended the 30 Years' War in Europe, had one clear milestone, which was to establish that each nation has borders, and that borders means that whatever happens inside these borders is nobody else's matter, nobody else's business. And therefore, countries, nations need to respect the sovereignty of each other, and therefore do not interfere in each other's matters, in each other's internal domestic matters. He sees that treaty as the point at which the world, and in this case Europe to a very large extent, has established an order. It's a very important point because he he doesn't try later on in the book to argue, or even in a subtle way to present that one order in the world is superior to another, that one order based on a specific culture is superior to another. Kissinger does not do that. What he does is to argue that the existence of an order is in itself superior to chaos. And that might sound a very lame point, might sound like, of course, an order is better than chaos, but actually, he uses it to present another idea quite quite rapidly after presenting the idea that order is better than having no order. And that idea that follows is that the invention of the internet, the massive success of the idea of social communication, of new generations coming in the world with so familiarity, that they are so familiar with the internet, with telecommunications, wireless telecommunications, with Twitter and Facebook and all of these different websites and technologies and God knows what. And in his view, this these these new technologies, the internet and what followed from it, are evaporating the barriers between the countries, which is exactly the point that the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 did, which was to establish the barriers, establish the notion that what happens in one country is not going to have supposedly an impact on another, and that a nation should not interfere in the matters of another. The internet and what follows from it, subtly he is saying, are evaporating those barriers, and therefore they are, to a large extent, diluting the notion that countries are not interfering with each other. Not in the sense that the internet is making one country interfere into another, but much more importantly, that it is changing the sense of belonging. So, 18-year-old or 15-year-old or 25-year-old somewhere, because of the existence of all of these technologies, have a different sense of belonging now than 20 years ago, and certainly than 50 years ago, where the nations, the barriers between the nations, the barriers in front of the perceptions of individuals were so high. Now, these barriers are going down very rapidly, that not only the idea of isolated political entities is being gradually diluted, more importantly, the sense of belonging to one country, to one culture even, is gradually being diluted. That threatens political entities in general, which is a point that Kissinger does not explicitly make, but it is very clear in his thinking that this gradual dilution, gradual erosion of the sense of belonging, and certainly of different barriers between different countries, threatens the existence and the sovereignty of political entities. And interestingly, if you run with that argument, you can say that it threatens social stability. And Kissinger makes a strong hint towards that when he addresses that point. The point that he makes it very clear and very explicit is that the pervasive presence of the internet and all of these different technologies, especially social interactions over Facebook and Twitter and what have you, are weakening political decision making. And to a very large extent, he makes it clear that there is a threat that important decisions, important political decisions, national security decisions could be affected by the likes over Facebook. How many likes this is getting, how many tweets and retweets a certain statement gets. And of course, it might sound a bit caricaturing of how decision making is, but what he hints at, and I think correctly, is that over time we are already, or we have been seeing already, the dilution of the quality of decision making, whereby it is no longer based on hard-nosed analysis, if it has ever been like that, and moving rapidly, to a large extent, rapidly towards the idea of popularity, of which decision, which statements, which positions are more popular. And that affects political decision making at or for important dossiers. And he sees that as a threat to political decision making. His methodology throughout the book is to look at within each order that is formed by a certain culture, to look at three things. To look at the formative experiences of that order or of that culture that has given rise to a certain order. And the formative experience, for example, in the case of the US, would be the War of Independence from Britain, would be the Civil War, and of course would be the fight over the right of slavery or abolishing slavery. So he looks at certain formative experiences and how they have shaped the order that culture, that nation gave rise to. And then he looks at the transformative episodes in that culture and in the history of that nation. And of course, he looks at the modern history. So he looks effectively in the last 200 or 250 years, since the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 was entrenched as a political order, if you'd like, for the world. And more or less in the 200 or 200 years after that, what were these transformative experiences or episodes for the different orders that he approaches? So again, for if you take the US as an example, that would be after the formative experiences of the War of Independence and then the Civil War. It would be the First World War, for example. It would be the presidencies of somebody like Woodrow Wilson or somebody like Roosevelt during the Second World War. He sees certain episodes and certain individuals as transformative, as episodes or individuals, and sometimes both, as people who transformed the key elements, key dimensions, key features of these nations, and therefore of the order that has governed that nation, or that has governed how that nation interpreted its own culture, which is also very interesting. It's a very elegant way, of course, because it allows you to look at any big nation, China, India, Russia, the United States, Europe, Western Europe at least, and say, in my view, in the modern history of that culture or of that nation or of that part of the world, these were the formative experiences in the 17th century or in the 18th century. And then in the 19th century and in the 20th century, these were the transformative episodes. These were the points at which this nation, that culture, changed, if you'd like, or new elements were introduced, or old elements were changed into something different, into something new, and how all of that has affected the order, again, the idea, the structure upon which the politics of these countries, of these nations, were anchored. The small problem, of course, of that approach is that it is very selective. So Kissinger chooses certain points as the formative ones and others as the transformative ones. He chooses certain individuals as the ones who played a decisive role in establishing these orders in different parts of the world. But somebody else might choose a different starting point, a different transformative point, a different person as the one with the more lasting impact in each of these cultures, each of these nations. So that's a point that I think is, to some extent, is a positive feature of the book, because it gets you to think as a reader. Do you agree with these transformative points? Do you agree that that person played more influence than that other person that Kissinger did not select? He chooses certain orders on the basis simply of how wide their influence and their effect have been over human history in the last 250 years. So of course the United States, because of its immense influence over the world throughout the 20th century, is one. Britain, of course, within the European experience is one, and Germany within the European experience is one, France within the European experience is one, and he lumps all of that together as the European order, which to a very large extent is the Western European order, of course, but he puts that as a type of world order. The other is China, by its mere existence, of course, and then India he looks at, Russia he looks at. Within the United States, if you look at his American order, he looks at the idea of isolationism, which was a founding idea in the American order, that this huge continent, super rich one, that came out from the European experiment, it started its life very much as detached, intentionally and deliberately detached from Europe. And that for him is, a founding feature of the American order. And one of the key points he plays with in presenting the American order is how the First World War, the huge Great War of 1914 up to 1918, how that war shattered this isolationism and more or less forced the United States to come to the world, if you'd like. Of course, the Second World War was the moment after which the United States more or less became the power shaping world politics, along with the Soviet Union, of course, at that time. But he argues explicitly that if you want to understand the American order, you have to look at two dimensions: how isolationism, how the United States, its founding fathers, and the key persons who followed them, especially in the 18th and 19th century, how they chose deliberately to be away, detached from the world, and then how the experience of the First World War changed that. He, in general, when he looks at the period in which the United States played the decisive role, in his view, and I think correctly to a large extent, in the last 70 years, so from the Second World War and until more or less today, he looks at the American experiment in shaping the world, if you like, or in playing a key role in shaping the world. He looks at the American order very positively. I would say extremely charitably. And he, even when he looks at certain episodes that many people would regard as problematic, as ones with huge negative consequences, most recently, for example, the invasion of Iraq in 2003, even when he looks at some of these episodes, he tries to put forward quite vague ideas about their results. So, for example, he's not arguing, but he links that the American invasion of Iraq in 2003 with the uprisings that we have been seeing in the Arab world since 2011, which are very much reflections of the wants and needs and desires and aspirations of a new generation of Arabs. He links the two. He's not arguing that the Iraq war gave rise to a want of liberation from dictators such as Saddam Hussein and others, and therefore led directly to the Arab uprisings, but he's making some sort of a question mark about whether it was a factor. And some would say that this is quite a charitable way of looking at the Iraq War. He does that repeatedly, if you would like. And in my view, that makes his analysis of the American order very charitable. And I think the problem with that is that it does not really offer American decision makers many lessons when they look at the last 70 years of the American order. And yet, still, it is a reflection, and therefore you cannot come and say, but this analysis is lacking something, is wanting, because in the caveat that he makes early on in the book, at the introduction, or in the introduction, is that they are just reflections. But his analysis of other world orders, and especially China and India, I think is less charitable, and that makes them more interesting and more insightful, I think. His analysis or his views on China are not new. Anybody who has read his previous book on China would be familiar with the points that Kissinger makes on China in this book, World Order. But The important thing in looking at his reflections on India and on China, and to some extent on Russia as well, is that he looks at them with respect. And I think that's refreshing, and that's very insightful, very smart way, because these are very old civilizations, and he not just acknowledges that, he actually takes that as a key, as a way of looking at the order that the Chinese civilization has given rise to. And therefore, in this way, he is not saying that this is a reflection on communist China. He is saying this is a reflection on the Chinese order, which of course has been shaped by communist China, by Mao Zedong and his successors, and most recently, of course, by the huge development that happened within the Chinese Communist Party. But he does not separate the experience of communist China from what has been before throughout the huge experiment, historical experiment of China. And I think that makes his reflections on the Chinese order extremely interesting. He does the same with India, though perhaps in a much shorter way and much rapider, much faster way. With Russia, he does the same, though I found it quite interesting that he does not spend time with the Vladimir Putin experiment or experience. And why this is interesting, because President Putin has been the orchestrator of the Russian order in the last 15 years. And right now, the book is has been very recently released. So for the past few years, many strategists in the West look at the Russian order under Vladimir Putin as a strategic opponent, if not a threat to the West. And that's why it is quite interesting that when Kissinger looks at the Russian order, he does not, to a very large extent, does not spend any time really with Vladimir Putin and what Vladimir Putin has done to this Russian order. So he looks at the Russian order historically, Catherine the Great, and even before that, Peter the Great, and how they shaped the Russian order. Of course, he looks at Soviet Russia, especially in the earlier part, Soviet Union, but he doesn't tell us how that evolved in the last 10 or 15 years through the influence of Vladimir Putin. But for me, the most interesting part of the book was when Kissinger looked at the Islamic order. He presents the Islamic order through one perspective, which is a distinction, a separation between Dar al-Harb, the abode of war, and Dar al-Silm, the abode of peace. And very simply, he says that within Islam there is a school of thought that distinguishes between Islamic countries as Dar al-Silm, as the abode of peace, where Islam rules, and the rest of the world, which is Dar al-Harb, which is the abode of war. And he makes a caveat very early on by saying that this is just one perspective within the Islamic civilization, and that there are many others. But he does not tell us really why he chose that one specific perspective to look at the Islamic order from. And there are two or different explanations why, but in my view, one of the most compelling reasons perhaps why Kissinger chose to look at the Islamic order through that perspective of the land of Islam being the land of peace and the rest of the world as the land of war is that in his view he looks at groups that are violent, that are using extreme violence, using force, extreme force and violence to present their ideas and impose their ideas. He looks at these groups, such as ISIS right now, for example, as the most potent, the most powerful within the Islamic world, and probably, in his assessment, as the ones representing the substantial percentages of Muslims, or at least young Muslims. Again, he does not say that, but the reason, he does not tell us why he chose to look at Islam only from that perspective, why he chose that specific perspective, that though there are so many others in Islamic history that looked at an Islamic order, tried to define an Islamic order, why he ignored all of these and just focused on that one. And I think probably it's because he chose, or he identified, the forces that espouse, that promote, that uphold that notion of land of peace and the rest of the world, or versus the rest of the world, as the ones that are most powerful and probably most representative within the Islamic world. And these forces are the jihadists, the Salafist jihadists, the violent Islamists, if you'd like. Another interesting point that Kissinger subtly makes is that he makes a clear distinction between the Islamic order and the Persian or Iranian order. So he does not lump them together into one chapter. He makes them two different chapters. One is on the Islamic order and another on the Iranian order. And he also does not tell us why he did that. But I think it comes from two factors. One is Kissinger's fascination with civilizations and with cultures. And of course, the Iranian, the Persian culture is so amazing, is dazzling with its poetry, with its art, with its paintings, with its artistic representations in so many things. And again, somebody with the background of Kissinger certainly found that dazzling and powerful enough to, on its own, give rise to a powerful culture that is represented by its own order. And Kissinger tells us, for example, that for so many years, the Persian civilization has looked at the world and put itself as the center of refinement of that world, and measure others' refinement through their closeness to the Persianness. And therefore, if you're close to Persianness, the more refined you are in the Persian civilization. And that's actually true throughout, or has been a true way, or it's a correct way, more or less. It's correct representation of how the Persian civilization has actually looked at the world in certain periods of time, especially during the 15th and 16th and maybe early 17th century. And the second factor, perhaps, why Kissinger chose to make a distinction between the Islamic order and the Persian or Iranian order is his personal experience. Of course, during the 1970s, Kissinger was responsible to a very large extent on the US's relationship with Iran, at that time ruled by the Shah, with Mohammad Rida Pahlavi. And he got to know the man very well personally. He got to know him, his family, his court, and of course later on Kissinger got to know others in the Middle East very well. He got to know Anwar Sadat of Egypt very well, the president of Egypt throughout the 1970s very well. He got to know King Faisal of Saudi Arabia relatively well. But I think his personal experience with Iran was much more powerful, much more compelling, and certainly longer than his experience in other parts of the Middle East. And because of the civilizational power of Iran and his personal experience with it, I think these two factors got him or led him to make that distinction between the Islamic order and the Persian order. But also, again, here, there is a problem with that distinction. And the problem is that if you look at the Islamic civilization, which in Kissinger's view gave rise to the Islamic order, it's impossible to detach the Islamic civilization from the Persian civilization. Many would say the Persian civilization was a key component, a key contributor to the Islamic civilization. In the 10th and the 11th century, some would say it was the most powerful contributor to the Islamic civilization in those centuries. And therefore, by separating the Islamic civilization from the Persian civilization, I think Kissinger makes a very artificial division that is, one, unexplainable, and two, dilutes, really, takes a lot from the Islamic civilization, which makes his presentation of the Islamic order even more problematic, I think. But I guess the final point that needs that one needs to reflect upon, especially if the reader comes from an Islamic background, or comes from a culture that is very much influenced by Islam and by the Islamic civilization, the takeaway that Kissinger leaves us with is not really, he's not an alarmist, not really the point that violent Islamism is the most powerful force within Islam today in his view. Though, of course, that would probably be debated a lot by many in the Islamic world, or at least those belonging culturally to the Islamic world. But really, the important point is not being alarmist, is not raising a red flag about Islamization of the Middle East or other places in the world, but really the threat that he sees that the Islamic world is slowly being driven by Muslims out of the international system. That he's telling us in a subtle way, which is the main characteristic of the book, really. This subtlety, these subtle messages, these very, some would say, insightful messages that he is putting without really emphasizing them and without really putting them explicitly. But here, when he discusses the Islamic order, by emphasizing, by focusing on the perspective that sees the world of Islam as the abode of peace, as the land of peace, and then sees the rest as the land of war, the abode of war, by focusing on that perspective, which is only one perspective amongst many others in Islamic history or the history of Islamic civilization, by focusing on that one, and by separating the Islamic civilization from the Persian civilization, these two factors tells me, at least, that he is raising the red flag not about violence, not about Islamization projects, but again about the threat that he sees to the Muslim world of it being slowly driven out of the international system by Muslims. And I think that's an interesting message to reflect upon.